Hi, Arthur Blank teachers. This is Ren Yu, our Director of Education, Research, and Engagement, and I'm here to share with you school readiness outcomes for the Arthur Blank YMCA for fall and winter of the 21-22 school year. Let's begin by talking about how we determine child outcomes. We determine child outcomes through the process of child progress monitoring. This is the process by which teachers observe and record children's growth in the classroom. All teachers use a system to record their child progress monitoring. Depending on the age you teach, you either use Teaching Strategies Gold or Work Sampling Online. These are both software programs that allow us to upload evidence of children's learning to create a portfolio that shows us where our children began at the beginning of the school year and how they have grown through all of our instruction. These systems also align children's learning with specific learning objectives or outcomes that help us work towards the goals needed for all of the children who we serve. Anytime we upload evidence into WSO or TSG, we're using the Child Progress Monitoring Cycle. This is our progress monitoring cycle. It starts with observing and collecting facts. This is something that teachers naturally do every day. We watch children, we record what we see or hear. We may record that through an anecdotal note, a photo, a video, or by collecting a piece of a child's work. This is how we observe, we collect very objective information about what our children can do. Then we analyze and respond to that piece of evidence. We look at that piece of evidence and we determine some things. We determine which children this piece of evidence applies to. We determine which objectives or learning outcomes it represents. And then we move into the evaluation phase. And that looks a little bit more like really analyzing that piece of evidence to determine what does this evidence tell me about a specific child. So you will do your evaluation process, for example, when you are uploading pieces of evidence to TSG and you place those pieces of evidence on the color bands for your preliminary ratings. You're saying, I'm evaluating this piece of evidence and this is what it is telling me about a child. It may be telling you that a child is a 4 on the color bands. They might be in a 2 or a 3, wherever they fall appropriately within that color band. And then we take that information and we summarize, plan, and communicate. So that looks like taking that information and pulling a report on TSG and asking ourselves, how am I going to group my students for small groups? We might ask ourselves, where do my children need more support? What objectives do I need to look at more closely and plan for? Or we may look at our information in TSG to determine where we need to upload more evidence of learning. And then we're going to use that to also communicate. We may share that information with parents during home visits and parent-teacher conferences. We may share that with other members of our leadership team. Perhaps we have some concerns about some children that we need to get some support for. So this is our basic cycle of child progress monitoring. We know that this is we're not always going to follow every single step here. There may be some times where you observe and collect facts, and before you have an opportunity to analyze and respond or evaluate, you might share that information with someone on your team or with a parent in passing. But for the most part, we're going to follow this particular cycle as we progress monitor the children in our classrooms. When talking about our data as a site, it's also really important that we talk about our goals as an agency. Data determines what goals we select every year for our school readiness plan, and it also determines where our children are, how they have grown throughout the year. So I'm going to share with you some of our goals from our school readiness plan, as well as some of our agency-wide goals that are based on some of the different grants that we have. So thinking about our goals for pre-K, all of these goals for pre-K, preschool, and infant toddler that you see on the screen are based on our school readiness plan. And our school readiness plan is based on the data from the previous school year. So what I did over the summer was analyze the data from the 2021 school year. Find the areas where we really need to provide some more support to children because we'd like to see more growth in these areas. We put this on our school readiness plan to communicate with all of our stakeholders, including our leadership team members, our teachers, and our families, so everyone knows what our goals are together. So just as a reminder, for pre-K, we're looking for kindergarten readiness. We're expecting children to gain meaning by listening, demonstrate phonological awareness, and speak clearly and follow rules for conversation. For preschool, we're looking for children to comprehend language, speak clearly, engage in conversation, and to notice and discriminate rhyme. And for our youngest students, our infants and toddlers, we're expecting them to engage in conversation as well as use social rules of language. And you'll notice for all three of our age groups here, pre-K, preschool, and infant toddler, the word conversation shows up in those goals. I've highlighted it in pink in each one. And I just wanted to draw attention to how important conversation is for our goals as an agency and for our children to learn. It's so essential that for every age level, that's really embedded in our language and literacy goals. And then, of course, agency-wide, we really want to see progress across all of our domains. There's not necessarily a particular percentage or number that we're trying to reach there, but what we want to see is that children come into our program and that we're able to establish a baseline for what they're able to do, and that each year we see every child who we serve grow from that baseline and flourish in our classrooms. So let's start by looking at our data from Teaching Strategies Gold. So the TSG data represents our infant, toddler, and preschool classrooms. And you can see here on this chart, fall is represented in the bright pink and winter is represented in the teal color. So this is kind of an overview of all of our domains. You'll notice that in social, emotional, physical, and cognitive, we basically stayed the same. There may be a slight decline in some of those. And then in language, literacy, and mathematics, we've had some growth over the course of the year. So after we complete this process and we look at all of our site level data together, we are going to take a deeper dive into some of our language and literacy outcomes. You'll notice here in language and literacy, you all had a great deal of growth in both of those domains. But when you do have an opportunity to look at your individual classroom data, you might want to look and see what social, emotional, physical, and cognitive looks like for your classroom, just to see if you're seeing the same kind of trend. You may see a little bit of a backslide in your group. That's okay. That's something that normally happens. It can normally happen. It doesn't always. But children, sometimes their growth may slow down a bit. Sometimes when children move from one color band to the next, their growth doesn't necessarily keep up with what's expected by Teaching Strategies Gold. And of course, we know that this has been a difficult year. Children have missed a lot of school. Sometimes if children miss school, we see this happening. We also see this happening when we're adding new children to classrooms. Your classroom makeup might look a lot different in the winter than it did in the fall. And so that could be the cause for some of these staying a little bit the same over the course of time. So all the data tells us is what was entered into the system, and then we kind of analyze it and take a look. So I certainly encourage you all to take a look at that and just see what it looks like for your classroom, and maybe do a little bit of reflection and think about why we might seeing data with these kind of growth or sort of degrowth patterns that we're seeing. Certainly every site is different. We experience different things. We have different children enrolled. So our data is all going to look different, and it's important for us to reflect about why does this look this way here. We may have some of the answers, we may not, but it is certainly something that we should put some thought to. So now that we've looked at an overview of all of our domains, let's take a deep dive into language and literacy. On this page, you'll see the language outcomes from TSG. So again, this represents our infant, toddler, and preschool classrooms. Again, just like the last slide, you'll see fall represented in this bright pink bar, and then you'll see winter represented in the teal bar. You can see here that for the most part, when we get down to our individual objectives, we're seeing growth. The one exception is 10B uses social rules of language. It looks like there's a little bit of a gap there where children were doing a bit better in the fall. It's a very small difference, but it's certainly something that when you pull this information for your classroom, take a look and see what that looks like for your classroom. And certainly have some conversations with your other teachers, have a conversation with your co-teacher. Why might that have changed in that way? Why wasn't there growth there? There certainly are a lot of possible explanations. You all are the expert on your children. You know how they come to school and show up every day, so you certainly have the answers for that. And I'll let you just take a few minutes to look and kind of look at each language and literacy objective and see where your outcomes are. Now moving into our literacy objectives for our students who use TSG for preschool, toddlers, and infants. You will see again, here we have fall represented in pink, winter represented in teal, and we do have one objective where our kids kind of stayed still, and that's 17A for uses and appreciates books and other texts. So when you are analyzing this data for your classroom, take a little look at 17A and see what that looks like for your class. You'll also notice 15C, 15D, and 16B are all at 100%. They were at 100% in the fall, and they remain at 100% for the winter. Sometimes that can be, people can be a little concerned about that. Why would we have something at 100%? But typically, these objectives are going to land on 100%. That's because these particular learning objectives are not necessarily developmentally appropriate for the students we serve. So for a child to notice and discriminate discrete units of sound, they may be able to clap out some of the words or the syllables in a word, but not necessarily be able to do all of the things when it comes to onset and rhyme and blending and segmenting phonemes. So when we look at those things, they're kind of outside the bounds of what children at the ages that we support would be doing. And so they are going to be at 100%. For most of our kids, those are going to be a not yet, and a not yet is going to be met. But even for our children who are a little bit older, our 3-year-olds, our preschoolers, we don't expect them to notice and discriminate discrete units of sound just yet, but we do expect them to take the first small steps into entering that color band. And so otherwise, you see a lot of great growth across these objectives. And again, I won't read these all out loud to you, but I will give you a few moments to review this set of literacy outcomes. And here's our second set of literacy outcomes for TSG. You can see here we've got another 3 objectives that are consistently at 100%, as they should be: 18D, 18E, and 19C. When we look at those things really closely, our children aren't going to be able to do those things. So writes using conventions. Children aren't going to be writing using conventions. They're not going to be using proper spacing and periods and commas and those things. They're not there yet. So for some of our kiddos, just doing some writing to express themselves is going to be enough for them to sort of be in that color band. And again, for many of our kids, a not yet is going to be met for them in these particular objectives. But if you take a look and sort of peruse the rest of these literacy outcomes, you'll see that we've had some great consistent growth from the fall to the winter in all of these areas. Now let's take a look at our work sampling online data. This is for our pre-K classrooms. And unlike our TSG data, for WSO, we currently only have one data point. We have your first checklist. So this is not a comparative like it was for TSG. Unfortunately for WSO, at this point, all we can look at is our baseline data where our kids entered. But that is important information for us to be aware of. It is essential that we analyze that. We look to see where our children are so that we can determine how to support them and where they need to go. So looking at our domain overview, you can see for personal and social development, we've got a few kids who are not yet, we've got a lot in process and a lot proficient. And then when we look across at language and literacy, mathematical thinking, scientific thinking, social studies, and the arts, we're seeing a lot of children in process, and then we're seeing some in proficient. Social studies, everyone is in process. In the arts, we have a lot of kids who are proficient already. So those are looking really strong. And then when you move down to physical development, health and safety, we do have some children who were in the fall at not yet, but mostly in process and proficient. So by looking at this baseline data, it tells us that, for personal and social development and physical development, health and safety, there's a lot of growth that we need to support children with there. And then it looks like with these other domains, our children are largely on track to at least being in process towards the learning goals within that domain. And now let's take a look at the language and literacy outcomes for work sampling online. Again, this is a little bit different than what we looked at for TSG because we only have one data point. So rather than representing different times, our bars represent who's in process and who is proficient. So teal represents the number of children who are proficient in an outcome, and the light pink represents the number of children who are in process. And so you can see when we're really looking at those first few outcomes for language, they look really, really strong there. So it sounds like, it looks from this data like your children are using a lot of language. They're developing really strongly in language. And so as we look at our literacy outcomes, that's where we want to provide some support. We have a lot of children in process. If you look at phonological awareness, appreciation and understanding of books and stories, we have 100% of our children in process. So that's great. But we may want to look at those and say, okay, how can we help children to become proficient in these areas? We don't see any other areas without any children who are proficient. So when you are looking at your actual outcomes for your classroom, take a look at those two in particular. See where your kiddos are and see where you could possibly take them. But this all looks fantastic. It looks like you have a really strong set of pre-K students who are doing pretty well so far in their language and literacy outcomes. So that's our overview of our data at a site level. If you have any questions or comments about the data, if you want to dive in a little bit further, I did have some questions that I asked during this presentation. If you do have some answers to some of these questions, please email me at renY@YMCA Atlanta. I would love to hear from you. And now let's talk about some next steps for a data review. We did look at your site level data, and that's very important. It's really essential that we know what the trends in our data look like, that we know what it looks like for our site overall, but it's also important that you know what your data looks like for your classroom. So for your next steps, you're actually going to pull and review a report about your classroom objectives. You can see here there are two how-to guides, one for TSG and one for WSO. If you click on the link, it will take you to the guide that walks you step by step through how to pull a specific report. We're only looking at language and literacy objectives for this, so you're certainly welcome to pull whatever report you would like. You can use the one that I suggested, or you can use the report that you know that you like to use. But when you do pull that, make sure you're just looking at language and literacy. So you're going to select two objectives that your children need support in, and you're going to write them in the center boxes of the support strategy, the data review support strategy form, and then you're going to include some support strategies for each objective. And these can be different kinds of activities. You can think about, what am I going to do during my morning meeting, my large group? What are some things I can do during small groups? But it can also be very small and simple things. You might think about different transitions that you can use. Maybe you can use alphabet transitions for children who need support around alphabet knowledge. Maybe if you have children in your classroom who don't very frequently tell about another place or time, you can find an intentional time of the day that once a week, every week, you ask every single kid in your classroom a question about what they did the night before. What did they have for dinner? What did they do after they left school that day? You can think about specific questions that you want to push in throughout the day. So this can be a really formal lesson if you want it to be, or it can just be, like I said, support strategies, simple things that you can do throughout the day to really help shore kids up in the areas where they need support. Once you've filled out your support strategy sheet, and you certainly don't have to fill out every little bubble there. If you'd like to, that's fine, but fill out as many as you feel like you need to for your class. Please turn that into Chanel. I would like you to keep a copy of it so that you have that to use in your classroom, but I'm also going to take everyone's suggestions and compile them into a big document that we can share across all of our sites so that everybody can have a really great resource for how you can support kids with specific objectives. So that might be looking at where you need extra documentation. Take a look at this resource and find some activities that you can do to find different documentation or to support specific children, anything that you need. I just hope it will be really helpful to have that extra document. And again, my email address is on the last slide. It's renY@ymcaatlanta.org. If you have any questions about this process, please feel free to reach out to me and let me know. And of course, any comments, any conversation that you'd like to have. And also, there was the link to the sign-in sheet on the very first slide of this PowerPoint presentation. If you haven't done so yet, please go back to that first slide and sign in so that we know that you participated, and you're certainly welcome to leave an evaluation. I would love to know what you all would like to know about data, what you would like to do with data, what's most helpful for you in your classroom when we talk about data. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, ask Chanel, ask Stacy, or email me. Thank you so much.